Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador. Now what I have here is Sony's FE2870 f2 G Master lens. Now the hero feature of this particular lens is obviously its f2 aperture. We've got a wide aperture that will emulate the sort of figure ground separation or background bokeh of a prime, but with the flexibility of a zoom lens. So what I'm going to do in this particular review is I'm going to compare it to three f1.8 prime lenses to see how this actually stacks up against Sony's prime lenses. Now obviously we're not going to use the G Master lenses, we're going to use f1.8 lenses rather than 1.4 or 1.2, and the three lenses I've decided to compare this lens with is the 35mm f1.8, the 55mm f1.8 Zeiss lens and the 85mm 1.8. Now I can't match the f2 aperture exactly, so I'm going to actually stop these down by a third of a stop, which should put that in favor of the primes compared to the zoom. And obviously I can't match the 70 with the prime, so I'm using the 85mm. Now you might be surprised with some of the findings that I'm about to reveal in this lens review. So without much further ado, let's get started. Hi and welcome to my review of Sony's FE2870 f2 G Master Zoom. Now this is an f2, so there are going to be a few compromises some would expect. So let's take a deeper dive. I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador. Okay, so the competition, well, there isn't really a lot of competition, to be honest. There is Canon's RF2870 f2L, but that isn't going to be adapted to the Sony's E-mount. So in order to use that lens, you'd basically have to switch camps and then buy a Sony mirrorless camera as well. So let's take a deeper dive. So probably you're going to want to compare this maybe with a 2.8 2470 G Master zoom. Now from this comparison point you can actually see that the 2470 f2.8 G Master is significantly smaller, and that is going to be one of the compromises of owning an f2 zoom. One of the advantages one might seem is that you could possibly use this instead of prime lenses. So let's take a look at the comparison again. So we've got Canon's 2870 f2L on the left there. In the middle we've got Sony's FE2870 f2 G Master, and on the right side Sony's FE135 f1. G Master. So you can see it's a little bit larger than the 135 prime and a little bit smaller than Canon's f2 zoom there. Now it is a 2870, not a 2470. In the rumor mill, some people thought that it would be 24, but obviously in order to get to that 24mm focal length, it would have had to have put on even more weight. And weight is probably one of the discussion points we need to have about this lens. Is this a little bit too large for what you're prepared to work with? Let's just lower that Canon on the side. The reason it looked a little bit longer than the Sony's lens is because of the body. So I've just dropped the mounting point to a standard so you can see that it's a similar size in length to the Sony. It is obviously quite a lot fatter and, as we'll see, quite a lot heavier. So let's take a look. There's not much in the length, it's all in the diameter and the weight. And if we look at the Canon's measurements, 3.15 pounds, 1,430 grams, and compared to Sony's offering, it's just a shade over 2 pounds or 918 grams. That makes it 36% less weight than the Canon. So I think that's lighter. Sony have a habit of creating lighter generation 2 lenses. Now this is obviously the first generation of the 2870, but they were obviously aware of the weight of the Canon, and so this was probably their benchmark they were working towards. Now size is a relative issue. If we take a look at Sony's 2870 f2 zoom, some might describe that as an extra large standard zoom lens at that shade over 2 pounds. But if we compare that with what many perceive to be a compact zoom, that's the 70-200 f4 macro G2 lens, which is a considerably smaller and lighter than the 2.8 G Master lens, then you can see that Well, there's not a lot in it. Yes, the 2870 f2 is a little bit heavier, but it's also a little bit shorter. So you would say if you're not prepared to work with that compact zoom, then you're definitely not prepared to work with that wide aperture zoom. So I also would like to point out that some people like to work very light. You know, they buy the Alpha 7C compact bodies, and then they prioritize buying small compact lenses, whether it be the compact zooms such as the 1625 or 2450 G lenses, or they buy these prime lenses which are also very compact. Now, obviously, some people do prefer the dual card bodies. They prefer a slightly larger body in the hand, and they are prepared to work with larger lenses. So this is a difference of workflow that we can look into in a little bit more depth during this video review of Sony's 2870 f2. Some would say that if you're prepared to work with the compact lenses, then obviously the big f2 zoom would be a little bit outsized for the size and form factor of these compact bodies. So I would expect that people with the Alpha 7C cameras would be looking at maybe the f1.8 compacts. Sony don't make f2 prime, so let's take a look at the 35mm 1.8, which has got a really good reputation, and also with an equally good reputation is the Zeiss 55mm 1.8. So two primes and two camera bodies would give somebody a little bit more flexibility because they're not switching lenses all of the time. Yes, they do lose the ability to zoom, but you can still get around the fact that some people are prepared to work with two primes on two bodies rather than one zoom lens on one body. I'm going to compare three 1.8 primes, and compare that to the performance of Sony's 2870 G Master. So this section is called 3 in the bag or 1 in the hand. Which would you prefer? And hopefully at the end of this little section, you'll sort of make your mind up about which way you'd like to go. Okay, so as I said, the 35mm 1.8, the 55 1.8, and the 85 1.8. Yes, we can't match the 2870 exactly, either in aperture or in focal lengths. So I'm going for these because these three have got a good reputation for being sharp lenses, and they've got the closest aperture to that f2 that we have on the zoom. So if you were to buy all of these new from, say, B&H, you'd be looking at $2,300. You'd be up over the £2. So that's slightly heavier than the single zoom, f2 zoom. And maybe the price point isn't too dissimilar either. I don't have a clear idea of the price yet. And obviously, as time passes, that zoom will probably be discounted a little bit further down the line. Now, one of the conditions that I often impose on myself when deciding what to take out is if it doesn't fit in my medium-sized Pilot 7L messenger bag, then it doesn't get to go out for the day's shoot. I could actually squeeze in two dual card camera bodies with the 2870 f2 and maybe the FE135 1.8. Alternatively, I might be able to squeeze in that 70 to 200 f4 G, the macro lens. That's not too big for this medium-sized messenger bag. I could get both of those lenses, both of those cameras in at a bag that would then weigh in at about 4.5 kilograms or 10 pounds. I am prepared to work with that weight on my shoulder for a day's shoot. Some people would prefer to work lighter. Some will not be constrained by a medium-sized messenger bag and either go for the 10L messenger bag or even a backpack. But I did want to point out that it is possible just to squeeze into a medium-sized messenger bag with that sort of dual body, dual lens configuration there. Let's take a look at some of the features of this lens. It's got the usual AFMF switch, two custom buttons. They both do the same thing. The reason for the second custom button is when we switch between shooting in landscape orientation to portrait orientation, and you've still got that custom button underneath your thumb ready to access either the focus hold or whatever you've reprogrammed that custom button to do. We do have an aperture ring, which is no surprise for the late model G Master lenses. We have an aperture declick switch, which obviously is an essential tool for videographers looking to change the aperture without having hard click stops. We've got an iris lock switch, so we can turn the aperture to A and then lock that in A and then control the aperture from the camera body. We have a smooth tight zoom switch. I didn't see that there was any lens creep when pointing the camera down, so it doesn't zoom when you're not intending to zoom. That's just really a workflow consideration, whether you like to have to turn the zoom ring harder in order to zoom or whether you want it much more free flowing. It's got linear response MF, which is a key feature for videographers again. And really importantly, because these lens elements are really quite big and heavy, it's got 4 XT linear focus motors. So I probably don't really need to tell you that this lens could keep up with the fastest sports cameras like the Alpha 1 and Alpha 9 III sports cameras. I do need to point out that the lens does extend by 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters when zooming from 28 millimeters to 70 millimeters. There obviously is some design limitations when you're trying to work in and get that lens in under 1 kilo. I don't think it upsets the balance of the lens. It doesn't seem to get front end heavy when you're just extending the lens out at the 70 mil focal length, so I didn't see it as a huge disadvantage. If we compare it to the Canon RF, just to see how well Sony did in the design front here, it's going to be a similar price. It's obviously 36% lighter and obviously shorter on the diameter. It's got a smaller filter because of that smaller diameter size than the Canon, so it uses an 86 millimeter filter thread instead of the larger 95 millimeter found on the Canon. It's got 11 rounded aperture blades, which should improve the bokeh over and above the Canon. We've got many more lens features on the controls, so the Canon is limited to a control ring which we can assign different functions to, AF/MF switch and a zoom lock. I'm not too sure whether that Canon creeps when pointing the camera down. You'd probably have to read a review on that one. Maximum magnification ratio of 0.18 times. This is obviously very important for close-up photography. We've easily bettered that with Sony's lens at 0.23 times magnification, which is not the best out there in Sony's lens lineup, but it's not bad. It's certainly better than some of the primes, and we'll take a closer look at that later. Minimum focusing distance obviously sort of works hand in hand with that maximum magnification ratio. Focus breathing, I found the focus breathing to be minimal in the fact that I couldn't really see that there was any. Some videographers might like to be a little bit more fussy on that point. If that minimal focus breathing was something that you weren't prepared to live with, remember you have focus breathing compensation on the latest alpha model cameras, so effectively you don't have a problem with focus breathing on this lens, and obviously that is one of the reasons you would possibly carry on buying this Sony lens over a non-Sony lens if one was made available at some time in the future. Just to show you that comparison test, I'll do this at 3 or 4 different zoom magnifications and we'll check the focus breathing. So you'll see me pulling focus and you'll see the buildings roughly saying the same size in the frame. As I change that, we'll just zoom in a little bit more, try that again. I think I'm around the 40 or 50 mil focal length. Let's zoom in again and try that again. And again, probably just a little bit more, but nothing to shout home about. And again, pretty much the same, consistent sized objects at any focal length on the focus breathing test. So when I was really quite surprised, because I'd have to own up here and say I do like lighter lenses, and you've probably seen me, I quite am drawn to these lighter zooms that Sony have been releasing. But one of the things that I started enjoying about when I'm reviewing with this lens, I found it to be sharper than all 3 of those f1.8 primes that I currently own. And I've never got a bad word to say about Sony's 35, 55 and 85 f1.8 primes. I think they're good value, but having bought all 3, you probably see that buying the f2 zoom may have just been an alternative for people who primarily want to work with one camera body and not change lens at all, but want the advantage of that wide aperture for figure ground separation or background bokeh. So let's take a look and just do some detailed comparisons between these 3, so you don't really have to take my word for it. Now, I don't have a lens profile for this pre-production model of the 2870, so I switched all lens corrections off in camera and in post-production for this particular test, so we can compare equally. There is a little bit of shading, well, quite noticeable shading at the 35mm focal length. This is going to be the first focal length that I do this comparison at, comparing it with the 35 1.8 there. Now, as I said, you will see that. I'm not going to try and hide that from you. Now, interestingly, if you were to switch on the lens compensations in camera, as I said, I don't have a profile in post-production editing software, so we're just looking at HIF file format here, not the RAW, and you'll see that once corrected, or once the lens profile does become available, you're not going to encounter any corner shading issues with this lens. Let's go back to the comparison. Here we're testing at f2, so I have stopped down the 1.8 prime by a third of a stop. So we're testing f2 with f2, and we'll take a look at the center sharpness first. Yes, it is a brick wall. I don't really like testing on brick walls, but this is the short duration of the test required that I do this. And I'd have to say, look, I'm not referring to MTF charts here, but I think zoomed into 100%, this is really very, very sharp on both the 35mm 1.8 and the 2870 f2 lens. I'd give those 10 out of 10 on the sharpness front. Obviously, if you're more fussy about sharpness, you'll wait for independent MTF shots to become available. Let's take a look deep down there in the corner and have a look at sharpness again. So remember, the zoom is on the right, and if you're viewing this on a large 4K monitor, you'll have already ascertained that the zoom is actually sharper than the prime in the corners, even though the zoom is working at maximum aperture and the prime has been stopped down by a third of a stop. So that's interesting to note, that we've got equally good center sharpness and better corner sharpness on the zoom. If we zoom in on some of those bright edges, you can see a little bit of lateral fringing, color fringing or chromatic aberration on the 35mm prime that is not present on the f2 zoom. And so I'm going to give the zoom 10 out of 10 for handling of chromatic aberrations in this regard. So let's take a look at the 55mm f1.8. That's a Zeiss prime. Has had a really good reputation for a decade now with that lens. And again, we'll test that with center sharpness. Again, we'll look at the bricks in the center. And again, I have to give them both 10 out of 10. That is equally performing as well as the Zeiss. I know it's 10 years ago, but when that Zeiss was released, it was often said that it was the sharpest autofocus prime lens at that focal length that had yet been designed. So the fact that a zoom can compete with that high accolade lens is great, I think. Let's test the corner sharpness, again going down in deep into the left-hand corner there. Now the Zeiss does get a little bit soft in that corner. Okay, so I'm going to have to lower my scoring down to 7 out of 10, but it's not spectacularly sharp. You know, it's not going to compete maybe with a G Master Prime, but I think it's doing really quite well in the corner there. So I'm going to give that 9 out of 10. I don't think anybody's going to be complaining about corner sharpness of the f2 zoom down there. Let's take a look at the 85. Ideally, I would have tested this with the 70mm prime, but we don't have one to test, so we'll test this with the 85mm. For people who want to use that 70mm focal length to do portraits, and the nearest portrait prime would be Sony's cheaper f1.8. We're not looking at G Master primes here, we're looking at that 85mm 1.8 lens. So let's take a look at center sharpness. And again, we'll zoom in to 100%, and I'm going to give it to the zoom again. Now, I'm adding a point there that it's a little bit soft on the 85mm prime, but that does sharpen up a lot if we just stop that 85 1.8 down a little bit further than f2. If you were to look at corner sharpness with that one, we can see that the 85mm prime is starting to fall apart. Not really a significant factor if you're just doing portraits and you're not putting the face right in the corner of the frame. But again, the corner sharpness of the zoom is really very good. Again, probably a little bit weaker at this longer focal length than at the shorter focal lengths, but still more than acceptably sharp for most people. Now, just to highlight that 85mm, I don't want you getting too distressed about that 85mm. I'd give it 10 out of 10 sharpness, both of them at the f4 aperture if we start comparing stop-down apertures of both of these lenses. And obviously the corner sharpness comes in on both those lenses at f4 as well. The minimum focusing distance of the f2 zoom is 1.2 feet or 0.38 meters, and that's across the entire zoom range, right from the 28mm focal length to the 70mm focal length. Now we're actually a little bit closer if we're measuring those distances to the front element of the lens. So we're looking at 8¼ inches or 21 centimeters from the front element. The maximum magnification ratio of 0.23 times for that f2 zoom at 70mm actually stacks up quite well against the primes. The FE35mm 1.8 prime is a little bit better at 0.24 times maximum magnification, but both the 55 and 85 are not as good. So if you're using the primes to get the maximum magnification, maybe the largest flower or largest wedding ring in the shot, you'd be using the 35mm prime and perhaps avoiding the 55 and 85 in that regard. So you are going to get that maximum magnification ratio at the 70mm focal length on the f2 zoom. So I possibly could have got close to this butterfly, but it flew off before I managed to get a little bit closer. But you can see if you're using one of the high sensor cameras, Alpha 1, Alpha 7 cameras, then you're obviously going to be able to punch in and fill the frame with the smallest of insects. So as I said, it's not a macro lens, but you can do some interesting close-up and just look at the figure ground separation because we're using that f2 aperture there. And we're actually getting a 0.5 times magnification ratio if we apply the crop factor to the original magnification ratio there. So yes, these are very small gum nuts in Australia that we're looking at now, and you can see the beautiful figure ground separation that we're getting, the background blur, which is great for this type of work. Getting in close or even getting figure ground separation with portraits, it doesn't really matter where you're getting this figure ground separation. The f2 does give you that advantage. The bokeh is becoming a little bit busier in this one at f2.8, and if we stop down to f4, busier again. So still getting shallow depth of field because we're working very close. So really where the f2 aperture comes into its own is when you can't get particularly close because you're doing group settings or head and shoulder portraits where you really want to lean on that maximum aperture for figure ground separation. But there's a bokeh comparison, as you see, getting busier as we stop down. So let's go out into the real world environment now and shoot some street and some portraits with this lens. Here we are stopped down at f6.3, and this is where you don't get a lot of figure ground separation because we can't get that figure popping from the background because it's a little bit out of focus, but it's getting busy. The structure of that background is starting to interfere with us looking at the hero subject sitting in the boat there. Compare that to f2. Now we're really blurring the background, even though these are 3/4 or full-length portraits, we can really blur that background with the f2 aperture. And this is essentially why you would be buying this lens, I think, for most people, is you're getting that figure ground separation by using a zoom instead of a prime. So getting in for half-length portrait now, significantly blurred background, and you can see some of the interesting bokeh off the light that's catching one of those rowing boats in the river there, so really quite nice. And Sony are going to say that the bokeh is really quite clean. Now, you might, some bokeh aficionados are going to say, oh, look, I can just make out an onion ring. But I don't think the clients of a wedding are going to be saying that here. You are going to give them that figure ground pop that they're actually looking for. Okay, F2 again on a half-length portrait. And I'm just zooming in on the last image so you can, one, admire the sharpness of this lens. It is spectacularly sharp, and also the beautiful bokeh that we're getting from that maximum aperture. Getting into a 3/4 length portrait now, and again some really interesting and beautiful bokeh there. Most people will be looking at the subject, but obviously photographers who really get into the bokeh will be looking more at the bokeh than the young woman who was organizing the oars on the rowing boat. Zooming in so you can see the shape of that bokeh in the background there. Here's a full-length portrait. Still amazing figure ground separation at f2. I'm almost certainly zoomed into the 70mm focal length just to maximize that as well. Going down into the deep alleyways, this is where a really wide aperture, not only for figure ground separation, but also because you're working in low ambient light conditions, this is going to be a strength when you're working at the very early part of the day, very late part of the day, or you're in some dark alleyways, as I'm doing here now. You can see shooting at a 3/4 angle onto a wall. We're just sort of keeping the Joker's eyes sharp and pretty much blurring all of the other paraphernalia around the Joker's head there. F2 aperture again in the laneway. We're shooting more front on now, so I'm getting a little bit more sharpness, so we're not getting that figure ground pop as we were. I'm using the light, the shaft of light in the laneway to do that for me this time. Some of these are at raised ISOs, and I will make the raw files available to my patrons on patreon.com so users can actually see the performance of this lens via the raw files. F2 aperture in a laneway again, and another one at the F2 aperture, now getting in for a closer shot. And even closer, so obviously as we get closer, that background continues to blur more. We're in so close now that you do have to be a little bit careful, because both of these eyes, because the head is slightly turned, only one of the two eyes is likely to be critically sharp. So you have to sort of play the game about how much critically sharp you want and how much background blurred you want. So that's how much background blur when you're getting up close to a tree in the city. And here's F2 on the bird that I shot on my last shoot in Queensland. It's a fast focusing lens. I didn't take it to a sports event. None were occurring during this review period, but I just tested it very briefly on some cyclists coming towards me. And yes, I didn't expect it not to be able to, but it can certainly keep up with one of the sporting cameras shooting 20 or 30 frames per second. And so no issues there. And some more highlighting the f2, because who really wants to see this lens stop down to f4 when we could use a G lens instead of a G master or a lens. And a little bit of doggy photography there, and a little bit of street at f2. Now, traditional street is usually captured at something a little bit smaller than f2, but I'm just showing you how we can leverage the f2 aperture to do a little bit of street photography as well. Obviously, going in closer than full frame, you will start to blur the background. It was, the background was reasonably sharp with full frame, but now we're getting figure ground separation. So if you did want that background pin sharp with some street photography where we're zoomed out, then f2.8 would do the job nicely. f2.8, enough to get most of the stuff here sharp, and f2 maximum aperture in a laneway, and stopping it down a little bit just because I want a little bit more graffiti either side of that doorway to be sharp. I'm happy to lose the graffiti in the background. Architecture, I'm no longer going to hold on to that f2, no need to. So just stopping down to f4, and I know from my testing that I'm going to get corner sharpness. I could stop down to f8, but I know I'm going to get the corner sharpness at f4 pretty much across all of the apertures there. Now, obviously for landscape photography, you still go for the f11 to get a great depth of field from foreground to background. And no surprises here, this lens is going to be pin sharp, corner to corner at the f11. and I stopped down to f16 in this particular instance, not because it's sharper than f11. I just wanted to slow that shutter speed down because I didn't have an ND filter. My maximum diameter ND filter is 82 millimeter, and this is 86 millimeters. So I just set the ISO to ISO 50, stopped down to f16, and got a second or so on the exposure just to blur that. And that is a second handheld because I'm using one of the latest cameras that has great steady shot. So you do often have to factor in that filter diameter. I wouldn't be putting cheap 86 millimeter filters on a premium G Master lens, so you are going to have to factor in another couple of $100 for your filter. And if you're going to buy variable ND, and actually you're going to get better quality for landscape photographers with a fixed density ND, you're probably going to buy two of these and end up with $500 price tag for those two ND filters. Okay, some concluding remarks. Because I'm a prime photographer, I didn't think I'd enjoy reviewing this lens as much as I have. And I think the turning point was the fact that it was sharper than the 1.8, which I often take traveling with me because I don't want to take my larger G Master primes with me. So the fact that it is really sharp and I can get it in my 7L messenger bag, which I travel with, it is a lens that I might consider at some time in the future. If you want to catch up with me, just remember my support channel, patreon.com/Mark Gaylor. I have 600 and 700 page ebooks for all the late model alpha cameras. I have Q&A forums where you can fire me difficult questions, technical questions that you're having trouble finding the answer for. And one of the reasons that you might want to choose that is I have noticed that more than 50% of the feedback on the Facebook forums is just plain wrong or inaccurate. So you might want to get some expert advice there. I have member-only seminars, which are 1 and 2 hour videos on a range of photography topics, which are not public videos. I make all of my raw files from my camera and lens reviews available to my patrons, and I have camera setup files or cam set files. So you can set up your late model alpha camera exactly as outlined in my ebook just by copying a file to your memory card and loading those settings onto your camera. I've covered most of the late model alpha cameras with a few exceptions, such as the A7S III, which I didn't get around to covering. I've covered most of the late model cameras with these extensive ebooks. And these ebooks do show you how to work with groups of settings. I don't go through the subject of photography in a dry step-by-step menu item by menu item, because often we're going to, half a dozen different menus in order to get a group of settings, which we then want to register as a memory. And these are an overview of some of the seminars I have available, 1 and 2 hour seminars. Hopefully you found this review useful, and maybe this is the lens for you, and maybe you're going to stick with the lighter zooms. Okay, so I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador. Remember to subscribe if you want to see future reviews.